The so-called pre-Columbian civilizations are those that developed in Central and South America prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. The best known among them are the Inca, Aztec, and Maya civilizations. Maya civilization was located in southern Mexico. It was organized in city-states, and its economy was based on agriculture. Maya society was divided into castes, and the cities were led by hereditary monarchy. They worshipped many gods that were linked to nature: the sun, the rain, the moon, corn, and many others. Contrary to the Incas and Aztecs, who were wiped out in the 16th century by Spanish soldiers who had come to conquer the lands of the New World, Maya civilization had already ceased to exist by the time of the arrival of the conquistadors. From the 8th to the 10th centuries, the great cities of Tikal and Copan were progressively abandoned for reasons we don't know. This decline was probably due to a combination of factors like war, drought, and revolt.
The world of the Maya covers southeastern Mexico, that is to say, the Yucatan Peninsula, Chiapas, and almost all of present-day Guatemala. At the peak of its civilization, it also covered a bit of Central America, including a small part of Honduras, where the famous site of Copan is located, and part of present-day Salvador. To summarize, Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, which was formerly part of British Honduras, and the Yucatan Peninsula. Aspects of Maya civilization dating back to 1000 BC have been identified. Recent research has brought to light a lot of information about the beginnings of Maya civilization. We now know that between 900 BC and 500 BC, the Maya was already living in the lowlands, building great cities, but these are very recent discoveries.
For over 300 years, Maya civilization flourished, then began to decline, and finally disappeared at the end of the first millennia of the modern era. Beyond their agricultural work, the Maya weaved cotton and worked soft metals like gold, copper, and silver to create jewelry and adornments. Then the feudal empire declined and deteriorated, first in the south, then in the north, well before the arrival of the Spaniards.
After the famous fall of the Classic period, around 900 AD, Maya civilization continued to exist in the late Classic, in the Yucatan region. Above and beyond this time period, the Maya remained in the Yucatan until the Spanish conquest.
At the historical level, the most ancient sites of Maya territory are not well known. Certain populations started to identify themselves according to certain characteristics, and this became the distinguishing mark of the Maya people around 1000 BC. So there was a progressive development for about 13 centuries. The peak of Maya civilization, called the Classic period, was the civilization's most prestigious period between 300 and 900 AD. Maya civilization did not disappear, though Classic civilization did. Maya populations did not disappear. They reinvented other lifestyles and established other sites in this last phase, which preceded the Spanish conquest between 900 AD and the 16th century, perhaps even later, since the Spanish often took a long time to reach this part of the New World. So there were Maya populations that continued to live independently and in keeping with their traditions into the late 17th century. Following the final revolt of the last Maya cities, the conquistador Montero conquered the Yucatan in 1547, and parts of the coastline then fell under Spanish rule. The cities located further inland, because they were smaller and isolated within the jungle, remained independent until 1697.
The Maya hierarchy was led by the king. The Maya king was a divine king who derived his powers from his ancestors. He was the intermediary between man and the forces of nature. He had the power of bringing rainfall, for example. He had supernatural powers, and that, obviously, was his strength. The divine king was surrounded by nobles who took care of the administration, managed the cities, and organized the wars. Below them in the hierarchy was the Saka'al, or governors, who resided in the secondary provinces, in the secondary cities and states.
Maya society was thus organized into independent city-states governed by noble families and local kings. Their greatest cities were Tikal and Calakmul at the peak of the Classic period, then Chichen Itza and Uxmal after the fall. In the Classic period, the Maya world was characterized by a huge zone of city-states. Each city-state occupied a small territory with a capital city located in the center or even on the periphery that managed the whole state. A certain number of populations in secondary sites, even in rural hamlets, depended on this capital city. There was thus a specific organization known as a city-state. These were sometimes very small. We're talking about city-states spanning a few square kilometers, but others had much greater territories. Overall, Maya territory counted over 5,000 cities. The biggest cities numbered a few 100,000 inhabitants.
There were 5 great capitals within the Maya zone, including Tikal, of course, the great city-state of El Petén in Guatemala, and Calakmul, located in Mexico north of Tikal. They were the 2 great rival cities of the Classic period. They warred constantly during the early Classic period. There is also Palenque in Mexico, Copan in Honduras, and other cities like Caracol. Maya territory was extremely well organized through the hierarchy of dependent cities.
The city of Uxmal, located in the state of Yucatan in southern Mexico, underwent a golden era in the late period. The name Uxmal is derived from a Maya word that means built 3 times. Its development, its peak, and its decline cover a rather short period over the 9th and 10th centuries. Governed by competent leaders and stimulated by alliances, Uxmal maintained its glory for about 150 years, from approximately 800 to 950 AD. Archaeological finds have revealed only the name of a single sovereign of Uxmal, Chanchak, also known in the archaeological literature under the name of King Chak. He built some of the greatest monuments of Uxmal between 895 and 907.
The diviner's pyramid at Uxmal was poorly restored. It is decipherable because there were many phases of construction. There are 2 temples, which are in fact from 2 distinct phases of construction. It was restored at a time when the norms weren't what they are today. This pyramid is absolutely gigantic. And beside the pyramid is the famous structure called the Quadrilateral of the Nuns. Of course, this is its modern name, given by the explorers who thought the palace might be a cloister, given its closed shape. In fact, this was the residential area of the elite. Beside it lies the court of a famous ball game, with a ring suspended up high, and other major constructions like the Governor's Palace. It is a very prestigious site, very characteristic of Puuc style. It is set a bit aside in the dominant position, but is thoroughly included in the site. A bit further away, there is a massive pyramid that has not been cleared. Thus, it gives the impression of being on the site's periphery, but that is not at all the case. In fact, this is the only zone that has been dug and restored. But there are other structures around it, which places the Governor's Palace at the centre of the site.
Even before the restoration works, Uxmal was better preserved than most other Maya sites, thanks to the unusual quality of its architecture. Most buildings were built using carefully sculpted stones, thereby avoiding the use of plaster. Here, Maya architecture proves elegant and beautiful.
Uxmal is a site that dates back to the recent classic period. It is an interesting site because it is characteristic of the Puuc architectural style. This site is particularly famous for its semi-mosaic stone decorations. The facades are very detailed. The mask of the divinity Shak is repeatedly portrayed here, with his hook-shaped nose or upper lip. Hooks protruding from the facades are very common at Uxmal. This site is truly characteristic of Puuc architectural design.
On the walls, King Shak is surrounded by a series of snake bars, the emblem of Maya royalty in the classic period. Thanks to the good state of its condition, Uxmal is one of the rare Maya cities that gives us a good idea of the overall aspect of a Maya city. The great changes in the site and the great constructions that can be seen today while walking around the site are linked to the King Shak. He reigned from the late 9th century to the early 10th century at the end of the classic period. It was not yet the post-classic period. But what is interesting is that at this time, many great capital cities of the Maya world disappeared from the central lowlands where they were located. Many major sites of the classic period disappeared before 800 or around 800. The sites that developed after 800, like Uxmal, are rather few and far between. The Maya worshipped the sun, the rain, the moon, and many other gods. They believed that they had been created by the winged snake god who had descended into the underground world of the dead and sprayed the bones of ancestors with his own blood, thus bringing them back to life. Ancestors were worshipped. Whether you were from a simple family or from the royal family, at the summit of the social hierarchy, you were part of a lineage, and you always had an ancestor who was particularly worshipped. I'm not completely convinced that the ancestors were deified, but in any case, a lot of care went into finding locations for their sepulchres. Specific cults were devoted to their mortal remains. The family's life was organized around these mortal remains. The site, the capital, was organized around the founder. A family's group housing was organized around the oratory, the burial spot of the person considered to be the founder of the family's lineage. The leaders of the highest-ranking ancestral lineage were buried and worshipped in the temples located atop the pyramids. In this way, nobody could ignore them. The deceased ancestor had joined the gods in the underworld naturally. But to what degree he himself became a divinity is not clear. But he was an important figure that had to be referred to. Maya religion did not remain unchanged over the course of its long existence. In the classic period, worship was centered around the king, the guarantor of cosmic order and the intercessor between the ancestors and the supernatural entities. Around 900 AD, the fall of classic Maya civilization brought about the fall of the divine kingship, and the priests then rendered worship to a pantheon of gods.
A certain
number of forces of nature considered to be supernatural were honored and worshipped by the Maya of the classic period. But were anthropomorphized characters truly identified as divine figures? That's debatable. The Maya worshipped over 50 divinities.
The text from the time of the Spanish conquest gives us some information. They refer to a rain god, for example. The god of fertility and rain was a masculine god named Shak. We know that there was a god that was a bit above the rest, named Itzamna. We know that there was, for example, a god linked to trade, named Ekchua. These names are from the recent post-classic period. But for the classic period, we have no names. For we know that there was a god of the earth, who can be identified through certain iconographic traits. Koak is the earth god, but earthly in the sense of fertility. In the post-classic period, there are also names of female divinities, like Ixchel, a goddess associated with the islands by the Caribbean coast. Spanish texts inform us that the rituals in honor of this goddess were carried out on these islands. Cozumel Island was a site of pilgrimage for women.
Palenque is a city located in the Mexican state of Chiapas. It is one of the most impressive Maya sites. Compared to the other cities, it was of medium size, but it stands out nonetheless by its architectural and sculptural heritage. The city had already been abandoned at the time of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century.
Palenque a bénéficié d'une école d'architecture tout à fait particulière.
Palenque was very innovative in architecture.
Un calcaire facilement malléable ou taillable. Et Palenque a innové.
In creating lighter vaults, they created spacious interiors
ce qui permet d'avoir des espaces intérieurs
and made for a more open architectural style that is easier for Western visitors to relate to.
Pour un touriste ou un visiteur occidental est plus parlante.
It is believed that the Maya founded Palenque in the pre-classic period around 100 BC. It was then a small village, mainly agricultural, with many streams and springs. The site's excavated zone barely includes 3 square kilometers, less than 10% of the city's total surface area. Over 1,000 structures still remain under the forest cover.
Palenque was led by a king whose tomb has been found. It is one of the most famous Maya tombs, that of King Pakal I. We have come to know this dynasty quite well through a number of inscriptions. It is one of the most famous dynasties of the Maya world.
Pakal I, the most famous of Maya kings, ascended the throne in 615. He erected most of the palaces and temples of Palenque, and the city then took the path of glory and splendor.
The pyramid temple is a pyramid substructure that is scaled, that is to say, it is a step pyramid. A staircase leads to the top. It is a raised platform on which stands a temple, usually made of stone, but not always. There are places where these temples were at least partially built of perishable materials, depending on the time period. The period temple was a place of worship, but it was also the burial site of the leaders. So the more we dig, the more royal tombs we find. Inside these pyramids are the tomb of the nobles, thus the idea that these temples were probably also sites of dynastic worship, linked to certain royal dynasties. Palenque is famous for its temples. Its refined architectural style with its mansard-like roofs and its aerial eaves.
The various temples erected atop stepped pyramids are grouped around a plaza. Each temple was crowned with a comb or roof crest, decorated with stucco and painted.
Alors, le palais de Palenque, comme tous les palais mayas,
the palace at Palenque, like all the Maya palaces, is a succession of courtyards surrounded by long, narrow rooms. This shape is linked to a construction technique that was common to the Maya people, called the false corbelled vault. This technique calls for narrow rooms and prevents the construction of multi-storied structures, because it makes for a very fragile construction. It is a defining trait of Maya architecture. There is thus a succession of courtyards, surrounded by long rooms that are reception halls, often decorated with bench seats that were considered as thrones, where the Maya kings sat during audiences.
Alors, autour de ces cours, on a à Palenque des séries de sculptures.
Around the courtyards at Palenque, there is a series of low-relief sculptures and stucco-modelled motifs. They represent the king as a majestic character, in some cases. Elsewhere, groups of prisoners emphasize the role of the king as warrior, as the purveyor of sacrifices, victorious in war, a king capable of increasing his territory and the prestige of his city-state.
In fact, the entire site is covered in inscriptions that still remain undeciphered. The kings of Palenque proclaimed that their ancestry originated in a very distant past. Some even bragged that it originated with the creation of the world, which in Maya mythology occurred in the year 3114 BC.
The Pyramid of Inscriptions is the burial site of the King Pakan. Today, we know that this pyramid was built to cover the tomb of Pakan. It was built, erected, and furnished at the same time as the pyramid itself, since the funerary chamber is located in the ground, under the pyramid, and a massive staircase was built within the pyramid itself to give access to the funerary chamber. So it is a dynastic temple that covers the tomb of King Pakan I.
In the early 9th century, Palenque played an important role in the region. In spite of this, emigration had already begun, and little by little, the sites were abandoned as the forest began covering them. In the 16th century, the region was nearly uninhabited.
L'écriture maya
Maya writing at this time was mainly done on steles. Texts were written in stone. Later, in the post-classic period, texts written on bark paper or parchment can be found. These are later texts. So there is an evolution from inscriptions set in stone to writings on perishable materials. In the classic period, at the peak of the great city-states, the texts were of political nature. They detailed the succession of kings, but do not discuss their lives. There is absolutely nothing on the details of daily life. These texts commemorated a king's coming to power, the birth of an heir or victory over another city-state, the capture and sacrifice of king from another city-state, All of this is commemorated in the monuments that stood at the centre of the city. They are thus inscriptions of a political nature. It is glyphic writing. It is based on glyphs, which contain a central image surrounded by symbols that are called either suffixes or postfixes, according to their position in relation to the central image. The signs can be read phonetically. It is a mix of ideographic and phonetic script. Today, most of this writing has been deciphered. Graphical specialists, not archaeologists, are working on it. They usually have undergone training as linguists. The deciphering has brought to light the dynastic history of the great Maya capitals.
Maya writing was not alphabetic, and writing was done by scribes who were among the superior caste. It is read from left to right and from top to bottom. There were certainly books in the classic period, but there are no books remaining today from that era. We're talking about a period of 6 to 7 centuries prior to the Spanish conquest. The classic period is very much prior to the conquest. No book has survived from that period. However, there are a lot of texts dating back to the classic period that are written in stone. These texts are sculpted, engraved in all types of stone, monumental rocks, steels, altars, lintels, foundation walls, and even small precious stones. Very detailed texts were written and represented on jade, even on earrings. There are fragmented writings, trace elements in stone materials.
Dans ces matériaux de pierre. Et puis on a énormément de choses sur les récipients céramiques.
And much was documented on ceramic recipients, especially during the time when polychromatic ceramic was in use. The scenes that are depicted represent either historical or mythological events. They include written texts, since most of these precious ceramics were made for special circumstances. They were buried with those of a high social order, especially the leaders. Many leaders were buried with these vases. One of the common phrases found on the ceramics is, "This is the cocoa vase of so-and-so, who was the governor of such and such, since cocoa was the ultimate beverage, the drink of princes and kings, the nectar of the gods." East of Guatemala, a short excursion beyond the Honduran border leads us to the archaeological site of Copan, located in the midst of the jungle. Like Palenque, Copan is an ancient Maya city that reached its peak in the 7th century AD. It was abandoned around the 10th century. Here as well, the remains are impressive.
Copan was a great Maya city in Honduras. It was the most southern of Maya cities. Here too we know of the reigning dynasty, thanks to the inscriptions and sculptures. There are numerous steles made in a particular style. Copan gives us lots of information about the dynasties that succeeded one another in this city.
The steles were closely tied to the notion of divine kingship. They represent the god king. Many of them are limestone slabs with many sculpted faces. The golden age of Copan came to an end once the king was captured and sacrificed by a neighboring city. The killing of the divine king must have deeply shaken Copan's society.
L'acropole de Copan est
The Acropolis of Copan is one of the best known and most researched monumental complexes of the Maya world. We know how the different buildings and temples are superimposed upon one another. There is one structure that is from an earlier period. It has been recently discovered with all of its decorative elements that can be seen when walking the tunnels at the heart of the Acropolis.
In fact, there are tunnels spanning over 4 kilometers beneath the Acropolis. Within these underground galleries, important tombs were discovered, and in one of them, the face of the Sun King looks down on us, frowning. Further north in Mexico, the coastal city of Tulum on the Caribbean Sea was a fortress of traders and a major fishing port. The city's foundation seems to date back to 564, as is mentioned in some inscriptions. But the major part of the remains date from the late post-classic period, that is to say, after 1200. Tulum was a prosperous trade and religious center until the Spanish conquest. The site was devoted to the worship of the divine God.
Tulum
is a major site of the post-classic period that is striking because it is by the sea. Its architecture is not very remarkable. There are small temples, small houses. However, it is very emblematic of the Maya post-classic period. Tulum was still inhabited at the time of the Spanish conquest, and until the early 20th century, villagers from the surrounding area would come there bearing offerings.
The city is extremely well located. It reveals the economic activities that had become very important in the early post-classic period, since Tulum was first and foremost a port. It is also a ceremonial center located opposite the Caribbean islands. It served as a stop-off for sailors returning to Honduras. The city is built on a rather porous limestone blocks. The constructions are of a rather poor quality, and many have become very eroded with the sea air. They were originally protected by a thick layer of stucco that aimed to cover all the irregularities of the constructions. Even the architecture has become decadent at this time. The grandeur of the past Maya cities is no longer.
At the peak of their civilization in Tulum, as throughout the empire, the Maya had no knowledge of the wheel nor of hard metals to make tools, but they practiced writing, astronomy, and mathematics.
Les Mayas sont de grands mathématiciens.
The Maya were great mathematicians. They performed calculations to establish their calendar very early on. We now know it was established in BC times. These calculations involved great numbers. They are also using zero. They were very much ahead of the European world at the same period, both in mathematics and in the observation of the stars, since they had a solar calendar. They could make a certain number of astronomical observations based on the cycles of the Moon and Venus. We also know that certain buildings were orientated towards certain constellations, in particular towards Orion. The Maya thus spent a lot of time observing the sky, the stars, and the changes in their positions throughout the year.
Chichen Itza is an ancient city, also located in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. In the 10th century, it was probably the major religious site of the region. Today, it is one of the major and most visited archaeological sites. Chichen Itza was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988 and was elected as one of the 7 wonders of the world. A prime example of the post-classic world can be seen in sites like Chichen Itza, for example. It is undoubtedly one of the greatest attempts in concentrating power at the time, around the 11th to early 12th centuries. Chichen Itza really seems to have dominated the totality of the northern peninsula during this period. No other city had managed to exercise such power over so large a territory.
It is a site that belongs to a current of Maya culture called Maya Toltec. Maya characteristics come to include architectural and iconographic characteristics of the high central plateau, at that time dominated by the Toltec civilization. Chichen Itza is a Maya site bearing elements that are completely foreign to Maya civilization, especially at the architectural level, including different types of construction, a different iconography, and different decorations.
On the site's decorative signs, Toltec themes depicting ball players, jaguars, eagles, and winged snakeheads alternate with masks of the Maya god Shak. Low reliefs depict warriors in ceremonial dress and prisoners in postures of submission.
There is a fully Maya area at Chichen Itza called Chichen Viejo. It includes buildings in Chenes and Puxtao, reflective of the Yucatan Maya. Then there is the recent part of Chichen, Chichen Nueva, with the Maya Toltec architecture. At the center of this Maya Toltec area stands the main pyramid, called El Castillo, or the Temple of Kukulkan. This construction is a very interesting example of combined Maya Toltec architecture. And it also helps us better understand astronomical rituals.
The winged snake, which was the effigy of the god Kukulkan, was worshipped on the Great Temple, perched 24 meters high. The orientation of the monuments confirms their stupefying level of astronomical knowledge. The pyramid itself is a stone calendar.
It is a step pyramid. In the setting sun, the step pyramid casts shadows that are projected onto the staircase, creating the illusion of an undulating snake descending into the underworld. The fact that there is a snake's head at the foot of the staircase indicates that this optical illusion was indeed sought out by the Maya.
The 4 lateral staircases contain as many steps as there are days in the year, and the 18 terraces correspond to the 18 months of the Maya calendar.
Nous avons des centres cérémoniels monumentaux qui étaient des secteurs habités, mais
there are monumental ceremonial centers that were inhabited sectors. But the residents mainly lived in buildings made of perishable materials that have not been maintained. In the best case, a small, low platform remains. Since the vegetation is extremely dense, it is very difficult to form a precise idea of the number of platforms in a given site. Estimates can only be very approximate.
The site of Chichen Itza, which covered 25 square kilometers in its golden age, has been carefully restored. But after a century of study, archaeologists still question the site's chronology.
Mayas sont connus pour leur architecture.
The Maya are known for their monumental architecture, their pyramid temples and palaces,
les palais,
and also for another very important structure, the ball game courts.
Ce sont les terrains de jeu de balle.
These three types of construction are found in all the ceremonial centres.
Relying on the great low-relief frescoes that surround the court, archaeologists believe that during the great celebrations, a team representing the powers of the underworld competed against a team representing light. Games could run for over a day.
Le jeu de balle, c'est un jeu d'équipe, en fait, deux équipes.
The ball game was a team sport. Two teams competed, making points by passing a rubber ball, rubber being a native tree.
Afin de marquer des points. Il y a différentes façons de compter les points.
There were different ways of scoring points. The ball had to bounce between the designated markers on the court's floor. The balls weighed around 3 and 5 kilograms and were extremely elastic and bouncy. Only the elbows and hips were used. In the game's classic form, no hands or feet.
Il faut que cette balle tombe sur des marqueurs qui sont fichés dans le sol du terrain de jeu de balle. Donc ça, c'est un jeu. L'autre jeu...
Another game including rings mounted on the wall of the court. It seems that the object of this game was to get the ball through the ring. But this is debatable because sometimes the rings are very small. Some researchers believe that the rings had other functions, that they were perhaps used to stretch a net that would have divided the court into two sections, like volleyball net, for example.
It is believed that the captain of the winning team was then decapitated by the captain of the losing team.
At the end of the game, there were human sacrificial rituals. In the classic period, the sacrifices were linked to fertility. A member of the team or a substitute person was decapitated during the ceremony, and the blood was left to run on the soil to fertilize the earth. Some say that the sacrifice person was chosen among the victorious team, since it was an honor in this culture to be sacrificed. A glorious death brought good fortune in the underworld. Certain archaeologists and anthropologists believe that the winners were sacrificed.
The decapitated head was then impaled on a wall designed for this purpose, just beside the ball court.
It is worth mentioning that these ball players were high-level athletes. If each game entailed the elimination of the winners, I think that the level would have quickly diminished. It is now believed that the person represented in the lower reliefs with all the attributes of a high-level ball player was in fact a substitute that somehow incarnated the winning team and was thus sacrificed in the ceremony. Human sacrifice has always existed in Mesoamerica. In this religious system, man was considered to be one of the elements of nature. Offerings to the god included flowers, birds, butterflies, felines, and men. Man was thus included in the world's nature order, and like other beings, he could be offered to the divinities.
While the victims of human sacrifices could be consensual members of the population, they were most often prisoners of war.
For the Maya, as for the other peoples of Mesoamerica, war was founded on the fact that people are not meant to be killed in war. War was a time for taking prisoners, and the prisoners were destined for sacrifice. War was also a ritual act, since the kings were taking prisoners, and if possible, prestigious prisoners, to offer them to the gods. The higher the prisoner status in the social hierarchy, the greater the value of the offering.
Sacrifices also took place on special occasions, like religious celebrations, during which many hundred people could be sacrificed. Given today's data, we do not have the slightest idea regarding mass sacrificial practices as they took place in the Aztec world. But sacrifices were performed during specific ceremonies, under specific circumstances. From the iconography, we know that self-sacrifice was extremely common and that the kings performed it upon themselves. This is heavily represented in Maya iconography. Of course, the self-sacrifice of the common people is not represented. Activities of the common people are not immortalized. But the kings had their actions transcribed on stone or in paintings, and often represented themselves as practicing self-sacrifice. Blood is a very precious element for the Maya. Spilling blood can appease the possibly opposing powers and can render grace to the favorable powers. Each divinity had its own particular sacrificial rite. Some victims had their hearts ripped out so that the sun may rise each morning. Others were drowned for the benefit of abundant rains. Some victims had their throats slashed and were then skinned in honor of the god of renewal and vegetation. Roaming amidst the ruins of this ancient, glorious civilization sends chills down the spine, due to both the beauty of the sights and the practices of this culture that seem to us dark and barbarian. At the heart of a lush and grandiose wilderness stands the city of Tikal, the land of echoes. It was inhabited from the 6th century BC into the 10th century AD. The ruins are located in the tropical forests of northern Guatemala, southwest of Mexico. It is one of the major sites of classic Maya civilization. The ruins cover a surface of 16 square kilometers and include over 3,000 constructions. Around the Great Plaza at the heart of Tikal stands a group of remarkable structures, including 43 steles and 30 altars, some of which are engraved with hieroglyphic texts and exhibit sculpted royal portraits. The Pyramid of Temple No. 1 is the site's emblematic monument. It characterizes its architectural style. Tikal is a model site, simply because it is the most excavated site. It is splendid and very particular due to its imposing size. Though it was one of the greatest cities of classic Maya civilization, with a population well above 50,000, Tikal had no water supply other than the rainwater it harvested and stocked in 10 reservoirs. This dependence on seasonal rainfall made Tikal vulnerable to prolonged droughts, and according to some, this could have played a role in the fall of classic Maya civilization in the 9th century.
It is a city-state made up of many monumental units that are linked by Sakbeob. These are roads, white roads, that cross through the lower zones called bajos. These zones are fitted out as water reserves and maybe also as intensive farming areas. So there are many monumental units linked by these roads that are more like ceremonial roads.
There are thousands of ancient constructions at Tikal, and only a fraction of them have been excavated. For many centuries, this city was entirely covered by the jungle before being rediscovered in 1840. At Tikal, the last known and dated inscription is from the year 869. The reason for the quasi-total depopulation of the powerful Maya cities in the early 9th century remains a mystery. Hypotheses have been put forth to explain the brutal fall of the civilization, then at its peak, but specialists still do not agree on the causes of such a radical upheaval. Wars, ecological disasters, famines, religion, or a combination of these factors are among the explanations put forth to explain the decline of one of the world's great civilizations.